Love staying informed? Subscribe now and get unlimited access to local news, weather, and sports for just 99 cents a month for your first 3 months at inforum.news/join. Read every story, listen to every podcast, and download the apps that keep you informed and on the go 24 hours a day. So head to inforum.news/join right now to subscribe. What are you waiting for? Get 3 months of local news for just 99 cents a month at inforum.news/join.
Welcome to Plain Talk, and boy, have we got a busy show. There is so much going on. Doug Burgum's running for president. There's new leadership at the NDGOP. Lots of stuff happening, obviously, out in Washington, D.C. By the way, speaking of that, our guest today, Congressman Kelly Armstrong. Kelly, how you doing?
I'm doing great, Rob. Get to go to Jack Brown Stadium in Jamestown for 13-year-old baseball tonight before I fly back to D.C. tomorrow.
Oh, you can't beat that. I was just at Corbett Field. I was speaking, since we're all baseball nuts on this call, with co-host Chad Oban. I went to my first Minot Hot Tots game. And it was a good time, man. Good independent league baseball. It was a lot of fun. I was happy to see it. When I was a kid in high school, I actually worked at the Minot Mallards games. I would do a little bit of everything, selling soft drinks. I ran the they had like a fast pitch thing where you could pay a couple bucks and see how fast you could throw a baseball. I did a little bit of everything. The last season, they actually let me keep the official score. I got to sit up in the score box and like punch it into the computer as they were doing. I wasn't the official scorekeeper, but I got to pretend like I was. It was kind of fun. But I
got to spend my morning watching T-ball, 5 and 6 year olds with poor 15-year-old coaches trying to keep them all in line over there. It's somewhat relaxing, but it's also really stressful to watch high school kids try to keep 5 and 6 year olds entertained.
The hardest age I ever coached, Chad, was 8U. My mom was a kindergarten teacher. I worked down, right? I was a Legion coach. Then I was a 12-year-old coach. Then I coached my kids' teams when they got involved. And after my first 8U girls softball practice, I drove to my mom's house and gave her a hug. I'm like, I don't know. It was the most exhausting hour and a half of my life.
Kelly, let's start off the questioning. Doug Burgum running for president. How do you feel about that? And also, I mean, if his campaign catches fire, there could be an opening for governor, which is on the ballot. How would you, have you thought at all about running for governor? 2-part question.
Well, first, let's talk about this, Rob. You and I probably connected as early as anybody in the Doug Burgum presidency thing. I was sitting in a layover in
I think I quoted you in my first article about it, and I was just calling everybody involved in Republican politics in North Dakota. It's like, is this real? Is this happening?
Yeah. It didn't surprise me. It doesn't surprise me. I think I've donated money to him. So, I mean, if you're going to give money to a candidate to run for president, that means you endorse him, right? I'm super excited about it.
So, Kelly, I noticed that you didn't jump into the second part of that question. So if Doug Burgum catches fire, would you be interested in running for governor in 2024?
I am on the ballot every 2 years. And yes, Chad, I would actively look at it, provided that I'm pretty proud of the work I do here. I would be more than happy to still be North Dakota's lone voice in the U.S. House. And more importantly, I would want to make sure that I would absolutely take a look at it.
Kelly Armstrong is one of the few politicians who answers those kind of questions just like straight up. No wishy-washy.
Both of you already know that's the case. I mean, why would I lie about it? I mean, that doesn't mean I'd do it, but yeah, we'd look at it seriously. We'd talk to, my wife and kids like the distance. I think it's because they like me out of the house. But, I'll have 2 kids in high school at that time. Politics is obviously very different now, very more spiteful, I think is a good word. So, I mean, we'd want to make sure it's right for Congress, right for the state of North Dakota, and right for our family. But to say I wouldn't look at it is just, that'd be lying to both of you, and you're both my friends. I wouldn't do that.
It's interesting because I never understood why politicians wouldn't answer that question. I mean, the answer Kelly gave is it's a hypothetical question. We don't know what's going to happen with Doug. Is he going to come back? Is he going to even if his campaign ends up petering out, which it may. he may not run for another term. We don't know what's going to happen. So I appreciate the direct answer, though. I guess the other question on the top of my list was there was a censure. Was it a resolution? Is that the right terminology? It must have been for Adam Schiff.
Yeah, it was a privilege resolution.
Okay, yeah. It was to basically censure him and also levy a fine. Now, you were one of 20 Republicans who voted against it, and you got a lot of flack. I was watching on social media. The well-known political pundit Cat Turd 2 was tweeting at you about it, along with his million-plus followers. And by the way, what an age to be alive when Cat Turd 2 has a prolific political following. But here we are. Talk about that a little bit. Why'd you vote against the censure?
Sure, it had a $16 million fine in it without any due process or any of those different issues. It violates the 8th, 14th, and 27th Amendment, and those things are all true. So I voted no. I think we'll have I served during the Mueller investigation. I spent 6 weeks in Schiff's secret bunker while he was actively leaking things to the press to drive a narrative, doing all of that. My good friend Devin Nunes, I mean, you could talk about all the different times that Adam Schiff knew different things and was saying different things on cable TV. If there's anybody who thinks Adam Schiff probably needs to be censored, I'm one of them, particularly with what Democrats did last Congress. But I am not voting for one member of Congress in a privilege resolution to bring a $16 million fine on another member of Congress. I'm not doing it.
Hey, Kelly, you indicated earlier that you're supporting Governor Burgum for president. You showed so by making a contribution to his campaign. But obviously, Donald Trump is still the heavy favorite, I think, looking at polls. And he's obviously got some serious baggage, being indicted 37 times. Obviously, he still gets to go to trial. How are you going to handle that? If he ends up getting found guilty of some of these charges, if he's the Republican nominee, how are you going to handle President Trump and throughout this whole next year and a half?
That's easy. It's binary at that point. I'm watching President Biden. I mean, right now, after being spanked down by the EPA twice at the Supreme Court, he's bringing Rule 111. Which is uniquely devastating to North Dakota oil and gas production. I've watched his Secretary of Energy. I've watched their EPA rule on clean power plants, which, if it goes into effect, will shut down 5 communities in North Dakota. So I'm supporting it. I mean, when we get to that point, I'm supporting the Republican candidate for president because I have watched this White House try and do things that are uniquely terrifying to anybody who does business in either the ag or the energy industry in North Dakota.
So, Kelly, just to be clear, Donald Trump is convicted of espionage. You're still supporting him for president.
Well, one, he's not charged with espionage, but he's charged with violating that, and he won't be convicted by that point.
Yeah,
I mean, this thing will not have been to trial by then.
Just to clarify, he's charged under the Espionage Act, but there's a lot in the Espionage Act that doesn't have to do
with spying.
It's not necessarily about espionage. Just to be clear about that part.
But I do think it's interesting that sort of the Republican Party right now. There seems to be a self-fulfilling prophecy that even before the indictment came out, the Speaker of the House and others were saying, "Oh, this is a sham sort of investigation," before they even saw any of the investigation to see what he did. The Republican Party that I grew up with was one that supported law enforcement, one that supported our military, and now you've got a former president who's leaking, security details, and Republicans are still lining up. Help me understand this.
Well, first of all, I mean, read the Durham report. I've been pretty critical of the DOJ there's an article out today where the Department of Defense is doing geolocation data on American citizens, not about if they're doing anything on foreign influence, but whether or not they're saying nice or bad things about leadership in the Department of Defense. Read the Durham report, go through the whole thing. Tell me, you could have 2 things that are true at once, Chad. You could say that President Trump's being treated absolutely differently than anybody else in this position. Hillary Clinton, James Comey, all of those different issues. And you could also say that sometimes he makes it easy for him. Both of those things could be true. I support every rank and file FBI member. I've worked with them in my personal life way before I ever got involved in politics. But if anybody thinks that DOJ and the leadership at DOJ doesn't need an absolute house cleaning, then I'm on the other side of that.
I think you can argue that the DOJ has not and the FBI have not conducted themselves well. And I think you can argue that there's a double standard perhaps at play, not even just about Joe Biden or Hillary Clinton, but also look at like Mike Pence, who also had some problems with classified documents, while also saying it's deeply troubling for a former president to have details about our clandestine operations, our national security intelligence about Ukraine, stored in his golf club bathroom.
But
does that not? Setting everything else aside, does that not bother you that he made that decision? And also, a big part of the case against him is obstructing a grand jury subpoena, where he was asked if he had the records and apparently lied about it and obfuscated. None of that bothers you, Kelly?
So, no, sure, fine. But yeah, absolutely. I think he uses bad judgment, and I think sometimes he causes himself his own problems. But you know what bothers me more? That they violated attorney-client privilege, that they have a lawyer threatening a lawyer for somebody else with not getting a judgeship if his client doesn't flip. That every time they're in front of the grand jury, they say anytime somebody talks about attorney-client privilege, that's an inference of guilt. This isn't a new place for me to be. You're always going to have these issues. I would say I don't worry as much about Pence and Obama and Bush so much as I think it's more. The more apt comparison is Hillary Clinton. Destroying cell phones with hammers, running a program called Bleach It on your personal servers, right. And then also James Comey leaking that stuff. I think there's some intent that involves in that, and that's what I mean. But that's one of the things. All of this stuff is going to get litigated. I think I would just generally say beware of legal experts that have never practiced federal criminal law, and really be aware of quitter legal experts that don't have law degrees. But I used to do this stuff, so. Everybody else on one side of the aisle is going to have their outrage. I have real concerns about how this stuff is being conducted, whether it's Donald Trump or anybody else.
Yeah. And, Kelly, you said earlier that two things can be true, right? The DOJ and FBI could behave poorly, and the stuff that Trump is doing was very wrong. It just appears to me like there's lots of folks who are leading with the DOJ can't be trusted, but ignoring the part about what Trump has done wrong. That's terrifying. What Trump has done is terrifying. And
there's a lot of people out there that's saying there's nothing to see here. There's nothing wrong with the DOJ, and this is 100% his fault. We live in politics, and it's binary, and I try and play somewhere. I'm not trying to do this to be a squish. I'm telling you, you've known me for a long time. Distrust of leadership and law enforcement is something that I come by naturally.
Sure. But I also think we are seeing polls where 80% of GOP voters are saying, I'm going to vote for this guy for president, sort of no matter what comes. And I think part of that is sort of this sowing of distrust into our institutions that Donald Trump said he could shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue. I'm starting to think that's true based on the response of Republican voters to these 37 counts.
Well, the DOJ and the FBI have earned a lot of this distrust, a lot. And I've been absolutely immersed in it since I got to Congress. We were just talking about it. I watched have to go into a secret bunker to do all these hearings when not a single thing we did was classified. I read a 1023 last week, which is not proof, by the way, but it is evidence that we're 5 years into this and nobody's ever looked at it. The president's son lied on a gun form. It's a strict liability crime. It's taken over 5 years to charge him with that. The sowing of the distrust is coming from the leadership of the DOJ. It's not coming from the public.
Yeah, I wish that we had more balance in if two things can be true at the same time. It's also true that Donald Trump frankly put the lives of our men and women in the military, the clandestine services, our relationship with our allies, the Five Eyes intelligence network. He did that. He did that. And the question is, do we want him back in the White House? I think it's pertinent to wonder if he can be trusted with the nation's secrets again, especially when we have a whole other field of other Republican candidates, including Doug Burgum, who I think, frankly, we could trust over Donald Trump. That's the case I'm trying to make. And I think you can make both cases at the same time.
Trump?
No, I do not. In fact, I haven't liked him since 2016. So
I've never noticed.
yeah. All right. Let's move on. Speaking of you being a squish, there's a new ND GOP leader, and it's somebody who has Sandra Sanford, wife of former Lieutenant Governor Brent Sanford. She was elected narrowly to be the new party chair. In the past, she has called for a primary challenger to you over, I believe what was motivating her at the time was your vote to codify same-sex marriage in federal statute. And then, over the weekend too, there was a state representative, Nico Rios, who was on Twitter, who was calling State Representative Nico Rios, who's a Republican from Williston. He was calling for you to also have a primary challenger. At first I thought he was joking because he said he wanted you to be challenged because you're short, which I never thought you were that short, but then he went on and called you a squish and not a real conservative, et cetera, et cetera. What do you make of what's going on in your state party right now as a former chairman of that party?
I worked really hard to keep all of those different things together. Chad just asked me about this earlier. I'm on the ballot every 2 years. I expect to have a convention challenge or a primary challenge and a general election challenge every 2 years. We'll either get help from the party or we won't. That's how it works, but we're going to keep moving forward. I don't listen. If I got fired up about everything bad that was said about me on Twitter, I probably wouldn't sleep very much. So there's a way to do it. You get the ballot box comes for me. I don't ever sit an election out, and we'll just work forward and keep doing what we do. It's not that complicated on my end.
So, Kelly, do you regret your vote to allow two adults who love each other to enter into a contract?
I do not. Also, I prefer states' rights, and you can't have states' rights if you don't have full faith and credit. And the Supreme Court spoke on it in Oberfell, and it's one of those times where I'm going to take the vote because I think it's the constitutional thing to do, the right thing to do, and I'll take the heat for it.
Well, Kelly, I asked the question that way because it's one of those things that drives me crazy that, again, conservatives wanting the government to dictate what two adults can do in terms of entering contracts into each other. It just doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah, but also this didn't force anything on federalism, right? If it did, I wouldn't have voted yes.
Right.
North Dakota still has a constitutional ban on it, and if Oberfell would ever get overturned, North Dakota's ban goes into effect. And that might not be a super popular answer with other people, but that's the way the law is supposed to work. And if that's how it's supposed to work, then we should probably do it that way. And I'm comfortable with that answer.
I like answers like that, I guess, as somebody who despite my critics now still thinks of themselves I still think of myself as a conservative, but I like it when we talk about federalism, right? Because sometimes the law doesn't produce the outcomes we want, and then we can change the law. But there's certain principles. America was set up as a federalist republic, which means states' rights. So your vote on same-sex marriage didn't say that North Dakota has to legalize same-sex marriage should the Supreme Court be overturned. It just said that the relationship between the states when it comes to marriage, Congress is going to regulate that as per the Constitution, and North Dakota will recognize a marriage license issued in Iowa or Minnesota. To me, that's a federalist position. Doug Burgum, was making this argument too the other day vis-a-vis the abortion issue. He was asked, would you pursue a national abortion ban? His answer was a flat no, I won't, because it's up to the states. We've spent so long conservatives have spent so long talking about how Roe v. Wade was a bad decision because it usurped states' rights. So why would he support the federal government usurping states' rights again by taking away their ability to, with a federal law of which I think would be of dubious constitutionality? How can you usurp states' rights again? So I talk about that a little bit, because there seems to be a lot of people who are very active in the Republican Party these days who seem to value the immediacy of results over, sort of a more principled take, like, well, no, the system is supposed to operate certain ways.
Yeah, I think, first of all, before the last election, Democrats had a 5-vote majority in the House. Now Republicans have a 5-vote majority in the House. The Senate was 50-50. Now it's 51-49. I think if you are really, really interested in immediate gratification and willing to abandon your principles on these things, you're going to see the pendulum shift back really, really far and really, really fast. And I know that, I mean, it goes that way. But I mean, and then the other answer is some of it's the politics of it. Like, I'm a little different, I think, on abortion and whether there could be national legislation on it. I mean, life, liberty, and happiness is the top side of it. But my problem is I just know the political reality. You can't pass it without exceptions, which I think there should be. But I mean, this gets back to the federalism argument in a more meaningful way, Rob. I don't want to federalize rape, incest, and the exception language because those are typically state crimes. And I've never seen anybody bring any kind of proposal forward that allows for state primacy on those issues with a national ban. And you have to be thoughtful about this stuff instead of just raging towards whatever gets you the most clicks or the easiest way to get people upset and angry all the time, because I can promise everybody who wants a national ban are the same people who want the DOJ and the FBI to be reined in. Well, those two things can't necessarily be mutually exclusive if you're now federalizing rape and incest because you have to have the exceptions.
Kelly, if you were on with us about a month or so ago, we'd be talking about debt ceiling right now. You were in the middle of that, and it's sort of one of those things that I think really exemplifies how difficult it is to get things done in this country and frankly in this state. Can you talk a little bit about that process, and then also what's come out of that? I mean, now there's lots of talk about the House GOP not living up to the deal in the Appropriations Committee, and I don't know how much truth there is to that, but can you talk a little bit about, as somebody who's on the inside trying to actually get something done to move this country forward, how do you feel about all this?
Yeah, I could do the positive, the negative, and the politics. I mean, the positive is for a state like North Dakota, when people talk about going back to Trump era permitting, what they're talking about is NEPA shot clocks, page limits, one agency review, reasonable amount of time, 1 year for an EA, 2 years for an EIS. All of that is now codified. That is now in law. For a state like North Dakota, that is going to be fantastic. We have learned from previous things like Obamacare, when you codify things, it's very difficult to roll them back. Yeah. I think the politics of this is pretty interesting because mandatory spending was off the table. I mean, and it was off the table on both sides. We had President Trump's running for president saying you can't cut Social Security, Medicare, all of those different issues. Both sides agreed that given the nature and the dangerous area of the world, that military is pretty much off the table. And we plussed up veterans. So you're dealing with 11% of the budget, 11%. Mandatory spending, 70%, 75% of the budget. When you add military and veterans into it, you're down to 11% of the budget. And in 11% of the budget, we got $2.1 trillion in cuts in the next 6 years, and got meaningful, substantive, responsible permitting reform, work requirement reform, and all of those things. So I mean, I agree with a lot of my friends on the far conservative side in the House, except on one issue. I'm like, we live in divided government and we have to get something that could pass.
Well, Kelly, speak also a little bit. I mean, we saw obviously the Speaker McCarthy come in, and it was tough to even get elected speaker. I mean, there was that drama of being multiple vote after vote. You were there. You, in fact, delivered one of the endorsing speeches for Kevin McCarthy. We've now run up to a situation where, in the context of the debt deal and some other things where, you have this relatively small caucus within the House, within even the House Republican caucus, that, are still, threatening to hold things up, to gum things up. Is this... It's actually been kind of remarkable to me that House Republicans have gotten as much done as they have. I was surprised that they've been able to move the ball up the field. Talk about that a little bit. I mean, how has it been governing when you have this faction within a very, very slim majority that sometimes doesn't seem that interested in governing?
Yeah, and by the way, I think it's really important to me that we don't necessarily group all of the Freedom Caucus or the conservatives in one group. I mean, there's different microcosms of it. But this is the only Republican majority to pass a debt ceiling bill without Democratic support. This is the only Republican majority in my lifetime to pass a border security bill without Democratic support. We've had some successes, I think, for certain people. There's a political benefit to snatching defeat from the jaws of victory. And I think some of that is how the incentive structure works. And I mean, from different ways of fundraising and all of that, but we're going to keep working forward. I mean, we've got the Farm Bill coming up. We've got national defense authorization. We've got appropriations working. But I can tell you, if we're not unified as a Republican conference, the same thing is going to happen this time. That's happened for 200 years straight. And this isn't a partisan thing. It's a chamber thing. The Senate will roll the House. I mean, that's just, and the Senate's controlled by Chuck Schumer and the Democrats. So I hope my friends on all sides of the spectrum recognize that if we don't have some strategy and some sense of unity moving forward, then we're going to have real issues with whatever we pass over versus getting rolled when it comes back.
So Kelly, you're in those caucus meetings. We hear about it in the national news, the yelling and the screaming and all that kind of stuff. Is the media overplaying the division within the House Republican caucus, or is it that sort of volatile?
No, it's not that volatile. It's emotional. I mean, they obviously, it was my bill on the floor 2 weeks ago that they held up trying to get across. So we deal with that. But I spend a lot of my time, Chad, actually talking to other members of Congress that get really twirled up and emotional really quickly. 10 years in criminal courtrooms across the state. I just don't. I mean, whether the longest rule vote in history was almost a day long, and it was Speaker Pelosi because the progressives revolted on. It was, I believe it was the apartment foreclosures or the rent foreclosures during COVID, but I can't remember. It never came up in the next election. The fact that the Speaker Pelosi had the longest rule vote in the history of Congress. I think we have to see the forest through the trees on this stuff, and it's the big things that matter. And we're always going to have fights, and we're always going to have those types of issues. For me, like last week, it was interesting because I actually really, really hate the pistol brace rule. Regardless of how you feel about gun control or any of those issues, the ATF is essentially making 25 million Americans retroactive felons. So I didn't want that vote to get caught in the crossfire with moderates versus conservatives. So that's what I said in conference.
Yeah, and just I should clarify, there's no doubt Republicans don't have a monopoly on infighting within their caucuses. I mean, you point out that
it's covered different in DC.
Well, yeah. I mean, the Dems just aren't the majority in the House, so it doesn't matter as much that they have their infighting there.
Yeah, and there was plenty of infighting. I mean, around Nancy Pelosi, there was a feeling about a lot of young Democrats. You're seeing the similar revolt about, Dianne Feinstein, where there's trouble with I guess there's questions about her ability to fulfill her duties on the job, which are fair, frankly. But
as a Democrat, she should resign. Dianne Feinstein should resign.
Kelly's uncut. We're talking about a different chamber now, but
I mean, as somebody who would really like Dianne Feinstein for ideological reasons, not to be in the United States Senate, it's a really tough way to watch a really storied career end.
Amen.
It just is.
I mean, again, all ideological differences aside, had a fantastic political career, starting with, at one point was the mayor of San Francisco and moved up the ranks. And it's tough. It's tough to watch. And it's an example of somebody just stayed around a couple terms too long. And also, go ahead.
By the way, since you're talking about California, nobody's asked what happens next on that censure motion. Nobody's asked what happens next.
Well, what happens next, Kelly?
We passed that motion, and here's what doesn't happen. Adam Schiff does not pay a $16 million fine, resign from Congress in disgrace, and drop out of the U.S. Senate race in California. Adam Schiff's either going to ignore the censure resolution or he's going to challenge it in court, and he's going to win. And then he's going to go raise a bunch of money and put himself in a better position to be a U.S. Senator from California. That's not anything constitutional. That's not any of those different issues. But I don't particularly understand the politics of it.
It's really interesting you bring up the raising money. I mean, I've been getting the Adam Schiff email addresses about him being fined by Kevin McCarthy for $16 million. Literally had no idea what he was talking about. I've learned more about this vote during this conversation. But I mean, he is raising money off of it. And I guarantee he's raising a ton of money off of it.
In the same way. And I mean, it's not comparable, but in the same way that Donald Trump, every time he got impeached or whatever, would similarly. And I guess that is one thing. And maybe this will be the last question for you, Kelly. I really worry about the amount of time Republicans are spending investigating Democrats and vice versa. And I realize that some of that stuff is genuine and real, and there are people that need to be held accountable, and there are real problems. But on the other hand, like I worry that we are normalizing, for instance, I mean, it's one thing to censure somebody. It's another thing to fine them. I mean, is that a new thing we're going to start trying to do, is levying these devastating financial fines on people for whether they could be upheld in court or not? Are we going to investigate, or, is every presidential campaign going to come with each candidate, vowing to criminally investigate the other? I feel like we're crossing boundaries with a lot of this stuff, and I'd like to just pull back. The question of pardoning, I know a lot of the candidates, including Doug Burgum, have been asked, the question about whether or not they would pardon Donald Trump. And I actually like Doug Burgum's answer. I thought it was good for him to say, listen, that's a hypothetical. The criminal justice process is not played out yet. And by the way, he can't be pardoned if he's not convicted. So, I thought people said he dodged the question. I actually didn't think that was appropriate. I didn't think he dodged it. I thought he gave a very nuanced answer. But I worry that we're getting to a point where it's just, does that worry you at all? And again, as somebody who worked in criminal justice on the defense side, does that worry you?
Yeah, I stood on the floor of the U.S. House and warned my Democratic colleagues when they censored Marjorie Taylor Greene and Paul Gosar. I was the only Republican in Congress, the only one that would go up to rules for 2.5 hours and fight with Jamie Raskin on contempt orders. I was and Rob, when I tell you that, I was the only guy. I was up there saying, you cannot do these things. First of all, you're wrong legally, which I believed it then, and I believe it, and at least constitutionally. And second of all, there is no going back from those things. And by the way, Biden's DOJ agreed with me on the vast majority of those contempt motions. So, I mean, this is what happens when you continue to move those ways. So I'm just going to keep doing it. People who I treat this stuff seriously, but I will go back to the investigations, and I think it's really important. And I did it in an energy and oversight hearing the other day about the CDC buying data on U.S. citizens. We talked about the DOD earlier. We're talking about the two-tiered system of justice and how that works. And that part of it, and like what the oversight committee is doing, is really, really important, because I mean, you might not like the principles that were engaged, and I understand why half the country doesn't. But that Durham report is a pretty damning report on both the DOJ, but more importantly, a court system that allows for secret warrants to be given on U.S. citizens without them ever finding out about it. And we are going to have to reauthorize 702 of FISA this year. And I'm telling you right now, anybody watching this or listening to this that thinks it's important to national security, it does not have the votes to get reauthorized, both from Democrats and Republicans. So these things have real policy consequences, but those weren't born out of Twitter. Those were born on real, significant abuses of a system that is essential to Americans' constitutional rights.
Hey, I know that was supposed to be the last question, but I'm going to shift back to politics on the way out the door here. So, Kelly, we heard earlier you're going to be on the ballot in 2024. How are you going to handle the state convention? I know that's sort of a hypothetical, but is there any scenario where you would go straight to the primary?
I don't think so. I will say this. I mean, there's always talk about the convention and the relevance. And I think one of the things that we forget, and I know this because I was a state party chair, you have a district committee and a state committee that's made up of 47 district chairs in varying positions. And they all want elected officials to abide by honor, do everything they can for the convention. But at the same time, you have a vast number of those state committee members that don't follow those rules. And it's nothing personal against Rick Becker or any of those other people. And if the NDGOP wants their state convention to be relevant, they should probably pass a law that requires the state committee at least to support their own endorsed candidates. And I know this because I got into a fight and I made a district chair resign when he wasn't endorsing. When I was the state party chair, I made him resign because he wasn't endorsing his own endorsed candidates and actually had filed to run against one of them. And I'm like, you can't do that and still be a part of the state committee. And it didn't make a lot of press, but it was a big fight internally. So, I mean, we'll figure it out. Like I said, I don't stress out a lot about any of this stuff. We're just going to keep moving forward, and we'll go win the convention. And then if we have to, we'll go win a primary.
Kelly, thanks for your time.
Thanks, Congressman.
Hi, everybody. I'm Chad Kuhl, host of the Northland Outdoors podcast. Hey, here in the Northland, we love our time outside. And on the Northland Outdoors podcast, we're going to talk about all of it. Not just fishing, not just hunting, but mountain biking, camping, rock climbing, bird watching, you name it. We're going to have it on the Northland Outdoors podcast. New episodes every 2 weeks on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts. So look for it and join us on the Northland Outdoors podcast.
Okay, just finished up our interview with Kelly Armstrong, and let's talk about what's happening in the North Dakota Republican Party. Because, and by the way, to catch people up, I guess if you're listening to this and you haven't been following along, maybe you spent the last weekend out of doors enjoying the nice weather and celebrating.
Beautiful June weekend. I'm sure people are just paying attention to your blog posts about the GOP leadership.
Right. You know where I was ensconced at my desk indoors, not enjoying the outside and instead writing about this stuff. But I'm sorry. I wouldn't have done it if I didn't think it was important. And it's important because, I mean, on one hand, you can look at the North Dakota Republican Party and say that I think people have a false notion about how important it is in politics. Like the party serves some important roles, but like in terms of the candidates who are already in office, the party doesn't raise money for any of the candidates, really. The party does very little, in fact, to help them. There's some recruitment things that go on. Obviously, there's some coordination with the national party. There's media buys. There's organizing, some like putting out campaign signs and stuff like that. But the impact is minimal. Symbolically, though, rhetorically, being able to speak as the chairman of the North Dakota Republican Party, that's going to carry some weight. And what's happened is Sandy Sanford, who is a outspoken culture warrior, I think that's the right thing. She was an activist involved with a group called North Dakota Can that promoted, the book bans, the pronoun bills, a lot of that stuff during the last legislative session. I know she was very active, particularly during the pandemic, in being critical of Governor Doug Burgum. I should say that the former Lieutenant Governor Brent Sanford, Sandy Sanford's husband, has denied to me that his wife's criticisms of his governor were a reason why he left the administration. But I don't know. She was sharply critical with him, and he left before the term was up. So I don't know. I don't know what to make of all that. She has called for a primary challenger to our guest, who just left, Kelly Armstrong. She endorsed Rick Becker over John Hoeven, although John Hoeven received the NDGOP's convention endorsement last cycle. She's, I mean, that's where we're at. So I mean, it's a very unique situation where you have a faction of the Republican Party that does not like a lot of the top elected Republicans, and they're now in charge of the party. What happens now?
Yeah. First of all, before we leave the Kelly interview completely, I like talking to Kelly Armstrong because he does this weird thing, Rob. He answers questions you ask him. Yeah. I mean, it's a really weird, cool thing. So it was great to have Kelly on. Thinking about like state parties and you talking about what do they actually do for candidates. If you're Doug Burgum, John Hoeven, Kevin Kramer, Kelly Armstrong, frankly, it's more of a nuisance than anything else. I mean, they do more for the party. Like they're
I'm sure that their campaigns are regularly kind of getting bugged to donate money back to the party.
Right. I mean, I think about back in the days of Senator Conrad, Dorgan, and Pomeroy. I mean, it was the congressional delegation supporting the state party, not vice versa. Often the state party was being critical of them for voting on, vote on guns or climate change or healthcare or something like that, where they were probably voting with the state more than their party. And so I think parties can be a nuisance for these kind of folks at high levels more than anything. I have a tough time believing, I have great respect for Brent Sanford, but I think I have a tough time believing that his wife, chirping on social media and taking shots at her boss didn't have anything to do with him leaving. I couldn't imagine sort of the position that put him in. But I worry, again, if, we came out of this last session where I think you and I agree that there's far too much time spent on social sort of cultural issues and not enough time on how do you pave the damn roads. This is going to accelerate that. We're going to see more trans stuff. We're going to see more book banning stuff. We're going to see more attacks on public schools. That terrifies me because I think you might see some of the more traditional Republicans deciding not to run again because they just don't want to have to deal with a state party who's pushing them on these issues.
I've already talked to a couple who their minds are heading in that direction. I won't say who because we were speaking off the record, but I can also tell you, so there's kind of two tiers in terms of the impact that this is going to have on elected Republicans. And you have sort of the statewide elected office holders. And I guess there's even two tiers there where you talk about, I obviously like Governor Burgum and then the congressional delegation, Kevin Cramer, John Hoeven, Kelly Armstrong. They're kind of in a tier on their own. And then you have, the insurance commissioner and maybe the attorney general and the treasurer. I have talked to some of the statewides, and they have expressed concern about showing up at the convention. One of them told me, I don't want to be standing on stage while somebody says something crazy at the convention, right? Like, I don't want to be like there's video of them saying this crazy thing, and now I'm in the background on the video for all time. I don't want that. Several of them said that, they're already going to start fundraising, fully expecting primary challenges from their own party. I mean, we're really kind of in a situation where, some of the top elected Republicans in the state are preparing for their biggest electoral challenge this cycle coming not from Democrats, but from their own party. That's a very interesting perspective. But then you go down the ballot and the legislature, the legislative candidates, whether they're incumbents or they're new people getting in, they're the ones who are probably going to be influenced by this the most, where you see that the party can probably have more influence over those candidates just because often they don't raise a ton of money. Their races are not decided by a whole lot of votes. That's one thing. And so one interesting thing that I wanted to get your thoughts on too was one of the things the meeting, the reorganization meeting where Sandy Sanford was elected, that was on Friday. And by the way, it wasn't just Sandy Sanford. John Trandom was elected vice chair. You go down the list. I mean, it was a clean sweep. The treasurer, the secretary, it was a clean sweep. So it's all the party. The entire party leadership is now in control of sort of whatever you want to call them, the Bastiat Caucus, the Culture Warriors, the ultra mega people. That's where it's at. One of the things they're already kicking around is the creation of what's called a legislative review committee, where they will essentially score lawmakers. I don't know how it would function, but I guess they would identify lawmakers who are, from their perspective, insufficiently ideologically pure, and then, I don't know, censuring them or saying that they can't receive party resources or something. And from their perspective, it's like, well, we just want to hold people accountable to the party platform. My argument is, well, now you're going to operate like the Communist Party does in China, where people who hold public office are supposed to be loyal to the party, not necessarily to the people who elected them. Right? I mean, because if it's the Republican Party platform, there are Republicans who get elected in, like, say, Fargo area districts that are very purple, that are not rock red districts, who are going to have to listen to their constituents and maybe veer a little bit. There's not going to be a lot of tolerance in the North Dakota Republican Party for that. Anyway, I've said a lot of stuff, Chad, but that's what's going on.
So a couple things. I mean, going back to the different tiers you talked about in the statewide. I mean, I've been thinking about some of the statewide elected officials that I have great respect for. I don't necessarily agree with them, but Tom Beadle, John Gottfried, Kirsten Baser almost got defeated last convention and the convention before. Why would those guys go to the convention? why not just go to the primary and just forego the state convention?
Where their name recognition and their fundraising advantage will.
Why even go through the chance of an embarrassing loss or embarrassing, thing being said while you're on stage? The other thing that was in your column about Sanford's election, but I don't think has been talked about enough is, Senator David Hogue, the majority leader, essentially picked a proxy that anybody would have known was going to vote for Sanford. And that was the vote that determined that Sanford was going to be the chairman of the party. Is that what David Hogue wanted?
Well, and the listeners, if you didn't read the column, so Senator Hogue's the Senate Majority Leader, and by dint of that, he has a seat on the executive committee, and so was able to cast a vote in these elections. And he didn't show up in person, and what people who spoke to him about that, because it's been known for weeks that he picked Senator David Clemens from West Fargo, who's very much kind of in the culture warrior camp, that he picked him to be his proxy. Now, first of all, if you know sort of the seismic shift that's afoot for your party, how do you not show up and vote in person? I don't know.
Ron Sorvag,
or if you're going to do it, like in the practice in the past, when the majority leader, the House, it's not unusual for them, or like the governor, for instance, for somebody to pick a proxy, right? Because especially like if you're the governor, you got a lot of duties. Maybe you can't go to the party, so you pick a proxy. If you're the majority leader, why don't you pick your assistant majority leader? Why don't you pick your caucus chair, Senator Kristen Rohrs, who probably would have voted for Perry Schaefer, and we're having then Sandy Sanford doesn't win, and we're having a much different conversation right now. He didn't. Hogue's decision, and I can't. David Hogue is not a stupid person. He's not, far from it. I think he's a very intelligent person, which means he knew the implications of what he did and didn't come down and do it in person, which I have thoughts on that. And also, sided with this faction, which surprises me. So, yeah, that was a very notable thing.
But we've talked about, like the last session, that some of the things around culture warriors, book bans, and some of those things, those weren't just sponsored by the Bastiats. Mike LaFleur was on one of the book bans. Hogue was on one of the book bans. So it wasn't just sort of a fringe sort of thing, these cultural issues. But in terms of having a committee from the state party to sort of green light or rubber stamp a legislator, here's the deal. I'm represented by 3 Republicans in District 35. Karen Carles, Bob Martinson, and Sean Cleary. They represent me. They don't represent the state Republican Party. I'm a constituent of theirs. And so I don't like the idea of Sean Cleary, Bob Martinson, and Karen Carles. And at least 2 of those 3 would probably tell the state GOP to, go do other things. But I don't like the idea of the state GOP having more control over those legislators than their constituents do.
Or trying to have that control anyway.
Right.
Yeah. Well, and to me, it's offensive to me because I don't think that the American notion of public service works that way. I like political parties. I think they serve a very important function, but that function is more as sort of like a social club where the people who are Republican candidates, they're not loyal to the party, they're loyal to their constituents. What the party tries to do is identify candidates who are going to support a platform of ideas, or certainly support more of those ideas maybe than another candidate would. Not to enforce absolute ideological loyalty to the party. Again, that's what communists do. That's not how it's supposed to work in the American system of government. So I find it obnoxious, even whether it's Democrats that were doing it or Republicans that were doing it. It's obnoxious.
Yeah, and if the decisions on what policy is going to pass by state legislators is being done at the North Dakota GOP headquarters or at their policy meeting, it also leads to terrible policy. I think anybody would agree having different views different Republicans or even progressives at the table leads to better policy, better ideas. I don't think one party or the other has a monopoly, or one segment of one party or the other has a monopoly on good ideas. I mean, Rob, you'll be surprised to know sometimes I agree with your ideas.
You frequently agree with my ideas, Chad.
Well, I think that it's time for some self-reflection for both of us, Rob, if that's the case. But yeah, I mean, we have to stop thinking about the state capital being sort of North Dakota GOP headquarters too, but instead that's a place where policy gets done and people do their job. And thinking about like statewide officials, being the insurance commissioner is not a partisan job. His job is to regulate insurance companies to make sure consumers are taken care of. If we start turning things like that into super uber partisan positions that are focused on trans rights and book banning and all those other things, it's going to lead to really, really bad things.
Right. I mean, because the notion of public service that we're talking about, and that I would argue has been what at least in modern times, as long as I've been writing about politics in North Dakota, has been what both Democrats and Republicans have been about. I mean, at any time in our state history, you could point to Republicans who are pretty liberal, probably compared to the rest of and you could point to Democrats who are pretty conservative. Across, I'm thinking like, for instance, Tracy Bowe, I think would be a good example of that. Pretty conservative person, relative to the rest of this Democratic caucus. It's always been that way, and it's always a reflection of where those people were elected. Tracy Bowe had a pretty conservative constituency up in District 9.
You remember Kathy Hawken? Kathy Hawken was a Republican.
Was a Republican,
and a lot of the Democrats,
and came from a pretty liberal district in Fargo. Although Kathy Hawken and Jim Casper were always getting elected on the same ticket. I don't explain that to me. I don't know.
The Jim Casper getting elected with Shannon Roars makes no sense. I mean, it's never made sense that Jim Roars continues to get elected in that district.
I don't know, but that's a subject for a whole other podcast. The point being that those people were serving their constituents, and they went in, they made the decisions they did in office, and then they went back to the ballot box, they explained themselves, and the voters either said yes or no. That's how it's supposed to work. Not I make my decisions and then I go to the party and explain myself. No, you explain yourself to the voters.
Right.
If the party doesn't like you, then I guess the party can kick you out. But
can they? You can still get your signatures and be a Republican on the ballot without being part of the Central Committee.
So
that's a terrible way to run a party.
Yeah. And that's one thing I'm interested in, is like, how aggressively are they going to pursue this? How aggressively are they going to go after it? I don't know. What I think is that if they get really aggressive, what they may end up proving is just how impotent they really are in terms of being able to. Because the statewides can just skip the state convention and go straight to the June primary. They gather their signatures, they put their name on the ballot. That's it. And that's why you're seeing some, for instance, John Trandom, who's one of the new vice chairs of the party, he wants to pass a law so that we identify on the ballot who's the convention endorsed candidate versus who just gathers signatures to go on the June primary. I don't support that. I think that's a little silly. The other part of the story that came out this weekend, which I think is really interesting, had to do with North Dakota Right to Life, which is one of the I don't know what you want to call them, but they're well known. They've been around for a long time. As you know by their name, they advocate on the abortion issue. And they had a very good legislative session, and North Dakota Right to Life participated in something that I thought was very good politics and was heartening. Because after the Dobbs decision came down, what North Dakota Right to Life and other pro-life groups such as the Catholic Conference and some others, what they did is they said, let's identify some policies that we can all agree on. Whether you're pro-choice or pro-life, it's going to be some things that we all agree on, and they're going to be focused on helping pregnant moms or new moms. And so it was things like expanding TANF for pregnant moms. It was exempting child diapers from the sales tax. Pretty low-hanging fruit, I think. Pretty good stuff. Now, the problem is you had some culture warrior lawmakers, such as Representative Jeff Hoverson, Representative Lori Van Winkle, Senator Jeff Magrum, who voted against some of those bills. Well, North Dakota Right to Life scored those bills. And when I say scored those bills, a lot of these issue groups issue what's called a scorecard, where they identify legislation that represents their agenda, and then they calculate who voted for them, who voted against them, and then they produce a score, like how pro-life was this person. Well, that because those lawmakers voted against those bills, they got a less than perfect rating from North Dakota Right to Life, and it made them mad. And so they complained to the board, and I have board president in my column today. I have board president Lancer Labar telling me that was a fact. That was a factor. They ended up losing their entire staff over it. They decided not to renew the contracts of like 6 staffers they had on contract during the session, and then their executive director and the director opted, saying, listen, if you're not going to support our staff, the organization's doing great financially. We just held a very high profile fundraiser. We're going to go too. And then it turns out that 2 of the people on the North Dakota Right to Life board are new NDGOP chairwoman Sandy Sanford and Donna Magrum, who's the wife of Senator Jeff Magrum. And so I'm looking at that, what happened at North Dakota Right to Life, is sort of a microcosm of maybe what's to come, where there's going to be an active effort to sort of purge people who are seen as squishes or seen as inconvenient for the culture warrior faction.
So, it's funny thinking about this issue. Before the session started, you and I had Senator Murdahl on, where we talked about this very thing, because people like me like to call out people who say they're pro-life and say you're only pro-birth because you don't do enough after the baby is born to take care of those families. Murdahl helped craft this whole package because,
to her credit, by the way, I think we both
voted 100% with North Dakota Right to Life on these things. This is what you should be doing. These are the kind of things that take care of babies. We talked to Murdahl about adoption. We talked about all these things.
That was another one of the bills was related to adoption. Another bill was creating a web portal where if you find yourself pregnant and you need help, it's like a one-stop shop where you can go and find out about all the programs that you're potentially eligible for.
But literally what North Dakota Right to Life did here was just fall into the same things that people like me accuse them of. They should change their name to North Dakota Right to Birth.
Yeah.
Because they're not thinking about life. They're not thinking about that middle part.
Their staff was. Because their staff effectively.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But that board of directors and that chairperson who made the decision to fire people I don't know Sierra Heitkamp, but she's now liberal. Yeah. I've heard good things about her. She's consistent. She's whatever.
Sierra Heitkamp, she was one of the she was one of the staffers whose contract wasn't renewed. She was their legislative director, I think was her title. She was basically their lobbyist. She was in charge of working with lawmakers and ushering these bills through the session.
Well, and this president or chairperson called her and the executive director out by name as the 2 people who basically allowed the scorecard to go through that legislators didn't like. The reality is helping people pay for diapers and helping people do adoption and helping with TANF for hungry babies. That's pro-life. And if North Dakota Pro-Life fires people for supporting those things, I think it's time to do some reflection. And these legislators who are angry about this because they didn't get their 100% pro-life score should think about the fact if they truly are pro-life or they're just pro-birth.
I agree with all of that. And then I agree, and again, it's a microcosm, I think, of what's coming. That's how they operate. Is it's 100% with them or you're out. There's no room for disagreement. There's no room for nuance. It's you're with them or against them. And I was trying to think, if they create this legislative review committee, and let's say we're talking about Representative Rob Port from District 5 in Minot, and I vote against the book ban bill, and they call me to the carpet, and I got to go before this committee and explain myself. I say plank 3 of the North Dakota Republican platform is we believe in limited government. I believe that usurping, that we already have local library boards who can handle this stuff. I think creating a statewide law is big government reaching down and usurping from local government. Tell me I'm wrong. There's no room for that nuance in the party anymore where I say this is a book ban. I don't think this is right. I think this is big government. I'm not allowed in the Republican Party. If the Republican Party doesn't have room for that kind of nuance, it's going to be a smaller party. And a smaller Republican Party means a bigger Democratic Party. Is that what they want?
So, Rob, I think, in thinking about the logical next step on this North Dakota right to life thing is if the Magrams, the Hoversins, those people are upset that they didn't get 100% and North Dakota right to life agreed with that they should change their scorecard. Does that mean Senator Murdahl and Senator Cleary and Senator Dever, who did have 100% on the scorecard, did they do something wrong according to the North Dakota right to life board? Who fired all these staff people? Because I would suggest the Murdahls, Clearys, Devers, and those folks that were at 100% actually were living and voting their values and the values of their faith and what's good for children in this country. It's very frustrating, but it is a microcosm, like you said, of sort of if you're not 100% with us, we're going to fire you or not renew your contracts.
Yeah. Or we're going to call you before our legislative review committee, or we're going to call for a primary challenger to you or whatever. And, it's going to be interesting to see what happens with some of the money, how, and also because it's an open process, if somebody, there's going to be a lot of lawmakers who are going to feel left out in the cold. There's going to be some statewides too who feel left out in the cold. How hard is it for them to file some paperwork, start a multi-candidate PAC, create a landing place for some of that money that would have gone to the party, and just filter it straight to campaigns and filter it straight to candidates who say, I'm just going to skip the convention and go right to the June primary. In the short term, that's probably a good path for the normies. I think it's one way that will demonstrate that these folks now in charge of the party have a lot less power than they think they do. But long term, what does that mean for the Republican Party and its ability to organize candidates and everything else in the future? Because it's in the short term, again, a lot of the statewides and stuff can get away with it. But eventually, if this continues, the party's going to deteriorate.
And Rob, I think something else to look for with this sort of complete turnover of the executive committee is there are some logistical things that a state party has to do in terms of tracking money, filing FEC reports. These things are complicated, particularly at the federal level. Are they going to run into issues in terms of how they're handling those kind of things, which again could do long-term damage to the GOP brand in North Dakota if they don't handle these things properly? Or if donors say, I don't trust these guys are going to handle this contribution, and I don't want my name in the paper for them mishandling my contribution. I don't know. I think that there's some complicated stuff that,
or I don't want my name in the paper, for somebody who, you look at social media posts of some of these folks. Do I want to be on the donor list for, on the publicly available donor list through a campaign disclosure for a party that is going to say some of these things? That's going to be tough, I think, for a lot of those candidates. They might feel safer donating straight to candidates as opposed to going through the party. So all stuff to watch out for. Very interesting situation.
Rob, what's the old story about a dog catching the tire of the truck?
Yeah.
We might experience that over the next year or so.
I had one state senator text me, somebody who was very much was always accused of being part of the establishment. He texted me and said, I guess I'm anti-establishment now. Because that's kind of true, right? Like you can't claim to be anti-establishment when you're the chair of the North Dakota Republican Party or when you're the secretary of the North Dakota Republican Party. Some of these folks, whether it's Jared Hendricks or Sandy Sanford or Rick Becker, value their sort of outsider status so much. I don't know what they're going to do when they're on the inside. I don't think they're going to have any idea what to do, because so much of what they are is just reactionary. Like it's just a reaction to what the establishment is doing or a reaction to what Democrats are doing, which I always think is very dangerous. Like as I'm writing about stuff, I'm not immediately opposed to everything Democrats are for. That would be a stupid thing. And that also, by the way, allows Democrats to define me. I define myself and I pick and choose and I look and I apply my reason and my logic and I try to seek out facts about the issues. And then I determine my own position. And that position is my position, regardless of who agrees with me. But I don't think that's how it is for these folks.
You just reflexively oppose anything Trump does.
That's not true either. I think that Trump, my case against Trump is not so much based on policy, although he did a lot of things I didn't like. It's based on character and competence. Anyway.
I like that. Hey, let's wrap this thing up right now.
Let's wrap it up. We don't need to delve into the case against Donald Trump again. Everybody's heard enough about Donald Trump. All right. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk again. Did you know Forum Communications Company has a robust podcast library? At inforum.com/podcasts, we have everything from politics, sports, true crime, outdoor adventure, and more. Visit inforum.com/podcasts and explore them all today.